Good morning, afternoon, and evening to our panel, to our participants, and welcome to the Renewable Energy Integration Learning Platform. This platform is an effort to assist the countries that were unable to receive fundings through the Renewable Energy Integration Program under the CIF by providing knowledge and technical assistance in a variety of forms. The platform was launched in June of this year, and the plan is to support a range of activities such as targeted expert technical support, South-South exchanges, dealing with common specific themes, studies and tools that help address persistent challenges. Today's event is responding to an issue which we saw broad appeal from our client countries: how to get greater private sector participation in renewable energy integration. So, according to a report of the International Energy Agency, IEA, to meet climate targets, there is a need to invest $1.7 trillion annually in clean energy investments in emerging and developing markets, in the developing countries, to meet the climate targets by early 2030s. Around 60% of the financing will need to come from the private sector. Equally, while investments in renewable energy has been increasing rapidly, nearly doubling since 2010, global investments in grids have barely changed. To meet the climate targets, and given the stagnation, the amounts need to nearly double from approximately 300 billion to over 600 billion per year. And clearly, the public sector alone cannot finance this. And this isn't an easy task. It is well documented that having access to large quantities of financing to develop grid-connected renewable projects is not so easy for the private sector. Furthermore, even when firms have access to funds, the terms are not favorable. To address this, one needs to find a way to de-risk investments and think creatively to do this. But getting the funding isn't the only issue or barrier to get the private sector involved. There are regulatory issues, there are market barriers that need to be thought through to reduce uncertainty and facilitate entry into the market, as well as to maintain its sustainability. Today, we have for you 4 experts that are well-versed with many of these issues. We start looking back. We have Mr. Joseph Mwanda, who will be joining us virtually. He's the Chief Evaluation Officer for the Independent Development Evaluation of the African Development Bank Group, who conducts sector thematic impact evaluations and project performance evaluations of AFDB-funded infrastructure, energy, transport, and water supply and sanitation. He also carried out a synthesis evaluation on the private sector development, as well as corporate evaluations. Mr. Mwanda will present the findings of his most recent completed evaluation on AFDB support for renewable energy over the last 10 years. From there, we move to Ms. Caroline Otonglo, Senior Infrastructure Finance Specialist at the World Bank, where she supports the bank's clients in developing climate-smart infrastructure assets across various sectors through financing, structuring, credit enhancement, and technical assistance, so as to crowd in infrastructure financing on optimal terms. She has 20 years' experience in project finance, corporate finance, equity investment, and corporate governance, spanning origination, structuring, execution, and closing of transactions, in which she has deployed debt, equity, and technical assistance across various sectors in various emerging markets. She will present different ways to mobilize financing for renewable energy integration. But as mentioned, issues are not only about financing. So we have Ms. Lori Bird, Director for the U.S. Energy and Polsky Chair for the Renewable Energy World Resources Institute, where she leads a team of more than 20 specialists who work with utilities, cities, and other large energy users to decarbonize the electric sector and accelerate transportation electrification. The team works to advance equitable access to clean energy, accelerate renewable energy and electric vehicle deployment, identify policy pathways to deep decarbonization, ensure wholesale power markets, enable the transition to clean energy, and facilitate innovative customer and utility clean energy solutions. She will discuss policy and regulatory options for integration. And also, Ms. Barbara O'Neill, who will be joining us virtually, the Grid Integration Manager for the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and a representative for the Global Power Sector Transformation Consortium. She leads projects and engages stakeholders to provide information on renewable energy integration practices, policies, regulations, and technologies. I was going to list all the countries that she has experience with, but that would use up half our time here. So let's just say she has extensive international and U.S. national experience, including with the U.S. Department of Energy National Transmission Planning Analysis. In the U.S., she participates in the U.S. DOE National Transmission Planning, She will address the issues of concern from independent power plant investors, such as curtailment and the effects on the private sector. We will proceed through the 4 presentations, and upon the completion, we will open the floor, both physically and virtually, for questions. So please hold them until then. We understand our audience comes from a variety of countries, which is why we have a simultaneous translation in Spanish and French. So virtually, you should see a little globe button on Zoom that will allow you to listen into the different languages and with different levels of sector sophistication. So we have purposefully allowed enough airtime for questions, knowing many of you might have specific questions, and we want to give you the opportunity to pose your questions to these experts. As we have around 200 registered participants, we most likely won't be able to get to all the questions, but we will do our best to cover as many key issues as possible. So without further delay, I will introduce Mr. Joseph Mwanda, who will be joining us virtually. And I understand he's going to be doing his presentation in French. So in case you need your little translation services, you might want to put him on now. Joseph, please go ahead. And I have the clicker to help you.
Thank you so much. Mesdames et messieurs, chers participants, bonjour et bonsoir.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, it is with great pride and honor that I take part in this exchange on behalf of the Independent Development Evaluation Department of the African Development Bank Group. We are meeting today to share crucial thoughts on the aptly chosen theme of unlocking opportunities for private sector involvement in renewable energy integration. The context of our meeting is of a particular importance because IDEV has just completed a comprehensive evaluation of ADB's renewable energy assistance for the period 2012-2022. This evaluation was officially presented and approved during the board meeting of the ADB in October. During my presentation, I'm going to focus on 2 fundamental aspects. First, I will briefly share with you what IDEV evaluated, including the approach taken and the methodology used. Secondly, I will discuss the findings and lessons learned, focusing on the key success factors related to today's central theme. Next slide, please. The main objective of this assessment is to provide guidance for the African Development Bank's renewable energy strategies and operational approach. The assessment covers ADB support for renewable energy production in the electricity sector. This assessment covers renewable energies such as geothermal, hydroelectric, solar, and wind power. ADB's interventions between 2012 and 2021 were taken into consideration. This includes investment projects and actions to create an enabling environment such as institutional strengthening, technical assistance, and project preparation. The assessment focused both on grid-integrated renewable energies in line with the central theme of renewable integration and on decentralized energy access solutions on a smaller scale. The evaluation examine the relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability of the bank's assistance. In terms of approach and methodology, the assessment adopted a theory-based approach and a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. The findings were established by triangulating information from various sources, including a review of the literature and policies, a portfolio review including 156 projects, 10 country case studies selected according to criteria ensuring diverse representation of national and regional contexts, interviews with nearly 250 key informants, and on-site visits for certain operations. Next slide. The relevant evaluative insights drawn from our assessment lifting the barriers to private sector involvement in renewable energy integration focus on 6 key success factors. They include bridging the gap between high-level vision for renewable energy and implementation on the ground, creating an environment which is conducive to private sector participation, using mixed concessional finances to increase private investment in grid infrastructure, adaptation and integration of renewable energies, deploying innovative risk instruments to attract private sector investment, developing partnerships and collaborations in the field of renewable energies, and ensuring long-term sustainability. Next slide, please. When it comes to the factor, it is essential to translate high ambitions for renewable energies into concrete actions on the ground, thus ensuring consistency between global vision and practical reality. The evaluation highlighted the central role played by the African Development Bank in the development of numerous strategic documents related to the energy sector, such as policy, strategies, and initiatives. This demonstrates a strong commitment to renewable energies on the part of the ADB. However, stakeholders have pointed out the lack of concrete action plans to complement the strategic documents, which has hampered the deployment of renewable energies. It has been observed that to attract private sector investment in renewable energies in emerging markets, investors need predictability and clarity when it comes to procurement. In this respect, the South Africa's independent power producer renewable energy procurement program, which uses a competitive bidding process, was cited as a positive example facilitating private investment in grid-connected renewable energy generated in South Africa. The existence of an action plan empowers stakeholders by giving them specific tasks and responsibilities, as well as a concrete roadmap to follow, thus encouraging greater commitment and participation in a renewable energy initiative. There's an important lesson learned from the evaluation, which has to do with the crucial importance of having concrete action plans to complement strategies. These action plans empower stakeholders by assigning them specific tasks and responsibilities, thus providing a concrete roadmap. This encourages greater commitment and participation in renewable energy.
Next slide. Diapositive suivante. It is essential to establish a favorable framework to encourage private sector involvement in renewable energies, thereby fostering investment and collaboration. The evaluation highlighted the fact that although infrastructure investments account for the bulk of assistance to the energy sector, the African Development Bank is stepping up its investments to address issues related to the enabling environment. This includes policy, regulatory, and institutional reforms to encourage private sector participation in the energy sectors of the regional member countries. In addition, the evaluation also highlighted active bank initiatives such as support for policy dialogue, knowledge management, and investment platforms in the energy sector. These actions are carried out through various programs and platforms, such as the African Energy Market, the African Electricity Regulatory Index, the African Energy Portal, and the National Determined Contributions Platform and the African Investors Forum. In addition, thanks to the CEPHA Special Fund, the African Development Bank has provided technical assistance and capacity building to policymakers and regulators in countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, and Senegal.
Joseph, are you still with us?
We have lost the speaker.
Just having some technical issues. Oh, Joseph, you still there? Maybe you just should skip to the next speaker.
Allô?
you're
Hello?
back. Okay.
Ah, vous êtes là.
Sorry, we are talking about energy. So what is happening here? Sometimes we have a power cut. So anyway, so I was saying that I was talking about. Non, j'étais en train de parler de l'environnement propice à la
I was
participation.
speaking about the conducive environment, and I was saying that on the basis of these facts, we have lessons learned. Firstly, the creation of the enabling environment is crucial to stimulating private investment, thereby supporting the deployment of renewable energies. Secondly, strengthening policy dialogue facilitates the development of strategic documents on renewable energies at regional and national level.
Give you 5 more minutes, Joseph.
Okay. Donc ici nous avons le forum l'exemple du forum des.
Here is the example of the African Investors Forum. This forum is a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary platform that advances projects to profitable stages, mobilizes capital, and accelerates transactions to financial close.
Next slide.
Using mixed concessional financing aims to increase private sector resources, specifically infrastructure, adaptation, and the integration of renewable energies. And we have lost the speaker.
So you had frozen there. Try again
Hello?
from this
Hello?
slide.
Hello, is it better?
Yeah, we hear you.
So maybe I need to go fast because this issue of electricity. So donc je disais que l'utilisation du
So I
financement.
was saying that using a mixed concessional financing aims to increase private investment by combining concessional financing with private sector resources, specifically for network infrastructure. We have lost the speaker.
Maybe take your video off. That might help you. Joseph,
Yes.
you might want to take your video off because your audio is cutting.
Okay.
Go ahead. Joseph?
Désolé.
Okay.
Hello. La qualité de la connexion n'est pas très bonne
The
aujourd'hui.
quality of my connection is not very good today. So I was saying then we have learned a few lessons. First of all, the infrastructure such as stockage and adaptation enables us to reach the results that we were hoping for. Secondly, with the intermittent production, this will make interventions, legitimate interventions, more useful. Thank you. Next slide. We want to capitalize on the success of renewable energy investment programs and the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, the CEFA, as an example. To attract private sector investment, it is crucial to put in place innovative risk management mechanisms, facilitating private sector financial participation in renewable energy projects. So, the evaluation highlighted the bank's ability to adapt to the growing role of the private sector in renewable energy with the evolution of its instruments. In particular, guarantees emerged as an essential risk mitigation instrument for the expansion of private sector investment in grid-connected power generation. So a few lessons were drawn from these findings as follows. Firstly, by prioritizing origination and sharing risk with private finance, we can increase funding for the renewable energy infrastructure development. And secondly, adapting the use of different financial instruments to national context enhances relevance. Thirdly, risk sharing, suboptimal risk sharing can impose long-term financial burdens on governments, contributing to pressures on sovereign debt. The creation of solid partnerships and effective collaboration is essential to foster the development of renewable energies, encouraging synergy between public and private players. One lesson learned is that from these findings is that establishing effective partnerships in renewable energies creates synergies and helps mobilize additional funding and promoting impact. Ensuring long-term sustainability. Finally, long-term sustainability must be at the heart of initiatives, ensuring that renewable energy projects are not just short-term successes, but also make a significant contribution to long-term environmental and economic sustainability. On a positive note, the evaluation revealed that the renewable energy interventions financed by the bank used state-of-the-art technologies that were generally adapted to the country's context, despite some shortcomings in their maintenance mechanisms. On the other hand, the financial viability of the ADB-financed renewable energy interventions was threatened by the financial distress of power utilities, including renewable energy. These renewable energies require substantial upfront investments and as such are vulnerable in the long term to the credit risk of the power purchases. One of the reasons for this is that electricity market tariffs in 36 of the 54 regional member countries, equal to 67%, do not reflect the real cost of supplying electricity. This leads to suboptimal markets and significant revenue shortfalls. To keep tariffs affordable, governments often subsidize the shortfalls. The literature review reveals that this approach is inefficient and poses a challenge to financial viability. Another important sustainability factor concerns institutional capacity. The evaluation revealed that the that despite the BAD's willingness to address government issues in regional member countries, its contribution to institutional capacity building in the country's renewable energy sector was deemed limited. Two lessons learned from these findings. Firstly, the need to improve the financial viability and utilities of the enabled large-scale deployment of renewable energies. Secondly, the importance of building institutional capacity to improve governance in the renewable energy sector. Thank you for your kind attention. And I apologize for the connection issues.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And since you mentioned guarantees and de-risking, we will now go to our next speaker, Ms. Caroline Otongo from the World Bank.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to all participants from wherever you may be joining us. My name is Caroline Otongo. I work for the World Bank as a senior infrastructure finance specialist based here at headquarters. And I work with a group of the World Bank known as IFG. I know our work is a little bit niche in the sense that, you know, what we do is a very small part of the balance sheet of the bank. Most people know the bank as a lender, so deployer of capital. We provide contingent liability, but it's a very important instrument insofar as helping the bank mobilize private capital is concerned. So IFG, which stands for Infrastructure, Finance and Guarantees, is part of a group known as IPG. We sit in the Infrastructure Vice Presidency at the moment, but that does not limit our role only to infrastructure sectors. Traditionally, we've provided services to transport, energy, and digital development, but increasingly we're working with our colleagues in water and sanitation, agriculture, and other sectors that are outside hardcore infrastructure. And I think this just has to do with the fact that the core of our work, which I will describe shortly, has had a lot to do with hardcore infrastructure in the sense of you know, providing guarantees, de-risking, you know, offtake obligations when it comes to private sector involvement in infrastructure. So our group, as I said, is called IPG. And in IPG, we have 2 trust funds and 2 operational sectors. The operational sectors are IFG, which is my team, which is the guarantees house of the bank. And in addition to guarantees, we also do financial structuring for the bank. So we are part of the bank. The bank is, you know, so public sector is our client. Governments are our client. As, for example, contrasted with MIGA or IFC, where the private sector is their client. And you'll see where I'm mentioning IFG and MIGA, because we work hand in glove in a sense. And that is just because the role of our team is to bring in really private sector in projects in which the bank is financing in our member countries. So we are involved at projects at what I would call the midstream to downstream levels. So when we actually have, you know, real transactions like roads being built or power plants being built or water plants being built, and this private sector participation, and I'll explain how. Our other operational sister unit within the same department, which is called the PPP group, supports, you know, the putting into place of relevant, let's say what we call P&I, policies, institutions, and regulation to mobilize private capital. So this really resonates with what Joseph has just described in the sense of having a conducive private sector environment to drive private sector participation in renewable energy and other infrastructure sectors. So our group supports countries as a whole to build sustainable infrastructure through technical assistance, which the bank likes to call TA, analytics, as well as investment projects. And investment projects will be familiar to many from the bank, because here we are talking about, you know, the typical bank financing products, which are through debt from the bank. So we have the DPL, we have the IPF as well, with which many will be familiar in this room. And don't forget that when you talk about DPL and IPF, typically we think about them from a funded perspective, so from a loan perspective, but that is just a product. We also have guarantees being part of DPL and IPF. And as I mentioned, IPG consists of IFG and PPP. And as a matter of track record, our investments, the bulk of them have been in renewable energy, so 83% counting to date. In terms of the deployment that we have facilitated so far, it's standing at 23 billion USD in over 23 countries through 30 transactions. And as you can see in front of you, I know the pie chart is a little bit small, and hopefully when they share these slides, you'll see in more detail. 83%, like I said, of our portfolio is in renewable energy. And then we have 7% in energy efficiency. And then the remainder 9% is in transmission and distribution. This is in terms of our energy portfolio, just to clarify, because we also have got investments in transport and so on. So just in terms of context, what are the challenges that are facing renewable energy investment in emerging markets? Like I said, our mandate is really to drive private sector participation in projects in which the bank is financing. And those of us from the bank will be familiar with the concept of MFD, which is talking about maximizing finance for development. And all it says is when we are looking at a project, we look at the most suitable form of financing. And the whole idea is to leverage the bank's balance sheets, to take it a step further, so that in addition to what the bank marshals, by raising funds in the international capital markets, we also want to bring in private sector. And we bring in private sector through the whole gamut of potential opportunities for private sector to invest in projects. So I would like to encourage the audience to move away from just thinking about PPP, because remember, there's a whole continuum of opportunities for private sector to participate with government. And also, just to bear in mind that private sector brings more than just capital. Private sector also brings in expertise. It brings in operational discipline and other benefits. And so when we think about renewable energy, in particular in emerging markets, what can be challenging for renewable energy investment from a private sector perspective is in front of you. The stability of the grid is a major issue. The financing cost that will come in with private sector is higher because obviously governments will always be the cheapest credit in a country. The issues to do with commodity prices, and these are, let's say, macro factors that go beyond a country. So they are international macro factors. I think we are living at a time as that we are seeing what the impact has been of various global activities, starting with COVID and the post-COVID environment. And we saw what that had on, for example, value chains. We saw what that had in terms of interest. We saw what that has had in terms of commodity prices and inflation. So when you look at our emerging markets, which are our client markets, you can imagine the impact they're facing now. Just as an example, right now it's a no-brainer for many holders of capital to consider the US market, because 5% rates is a very sweet rate for almost no risk, and vis-a-vis, for example, our emerging markets where the cost will be much higher. Forget about the same in local currency, just even in US dollars. And then there's also the issue of risk aversion, which of course increases due diligence time and cost. The big challenges that we're always dealing with in terms of the regulatory frameworks and policies, which are still very shaky in many of our client countries, and which we are working hard to improve, because like Joseph rightfully said, private sector requires stability, it requires predictability by the time the investment committees are making the decisions to invest. The challenge of investors unwilling to take FX risk, meaning that projects are still being financed in hard currencies. And we are seeing real time what that is implying for our client countries right now. Number one, access to USD. Number two, the interest rates increase in USD. So even if the project is indexed, at the end of the day, the costs are being transferred to the consumer. And when you think about who the consumer is in our client countries, I think many of us know what we are dealing with. It just becomes an untenable position. And really today, you're looking at a situation where in many of our client countries, even accessing, so entities that borrowed in dollars, maybe because it was cheaper, many times it is cheaper, are facing a problem of not just being able to afford the rates now, because of course, the base moves and now we are in SOFR territory, but leave alone that even accessing the dollar currency to pay is a real challenge. And then of course, the challenge of monopolistic market structures, the grid is not very stable, there are lots of losses, and then, challenges in terms of system planning and operation, just to mention a few. Okay, I'm going to go a bit faster now, just because I'm halfway through time. Oh, am I going backwards? Apologies. Okay, so what do we do from an IPG perspective to mobilize private capital? I talked about the fact that you have a PPP group that comes in more upstream to ensure that you have a conducive environment for private sector. So they come in at the level of the policies and the regulations to put in place the correct policies to ensure that the institutions are strong and robust. And then at the level of beginning to consider the prioritization and planning of projects where actual infrastructure projects have been planned by government, they bring in sector and diagnostic skills and tools from the World Bank. When projects have actually been identified by government and are being procured, and the decision has been made that these projects are more suitable for private sector because it goes through a whole decision-making filtrage process. So there's a real project being conceived, and this project is potentially private sector. Our group comes in to help structure the projects to ensure that they are de-risked and there's proper risk allocation. And we bring in transaction support also through guarantees where there may be the need to enhance the credit of the off-taker or of the government counterparty, and also to support during contract management. So the purpose of this slide, and when you receive the slides, I'm sure you'll see in more detail. I'm sorry, it's a little bit busy. It's just to tell you the gamut of tools that the bank has at its disposal and how it is that we support our clients who are governments to ensure that in the event projects are being procured that need private sector, this is what we can do to help governments get the best deal. So meaning they get the best affordable project with private sector bringing in all its benefits. So we mobilize long-term private capital. We ensure market access by structuring the projects to become bankable, providing relevant guarantees, whether it's payment guarantees or loan guarantees to enhance market access for our clients, and therefore ensuring affordability for emerging market clients to ensure that the projects are ultimately affordable and resilient and client relevant. Improved financing terms, like we discussed, this comes through a balanced risk allocation. Many times our client counterparts are sitting across private sector enterprises who are very experienced in doing these projects and are more sophisticated just from the exposure that they've had, not because they're any better in particular. And then being on the side of government to ensure that the risk is properly allocated and therefore ultimately the costs make sense. And then also we bring in the bank's, convening power. And of course, climate smartness is sort of the mode du jour. It's the most important word of the day, and the bank does this very well. Okay, so we mobilize long-term private capital for renewable energy. As you can see in the screen in front of you, it's a long road ahead. And these are the various steps where we hold the hands of our clients literally from the level of actual program identification with the regional teams from the beginning, remembering that the bank is now highly decentralized and our team is highly centralized, sitting in headquarters mostly, and with a small outpost in Singapore, working with the CMUs, working with the sectors hand in glove, from the moment that projects are identified up until the time when the projects go to implementation. So as I mentioned, we have a menu of solutions, remembering that the bank has financial instruments and each instrument has various solutions. And our key instrument for us is the guarantees. It's a de-risking instrument. As Joseph said, guarantees are critical for enhancing credit of counterparties and for de-risking projects, and they drive down costs, which is very important for our clients. Because remember, when you bring in private sector, of course, is going to get private financing, which is more expensive than what government can borrow, number one. Of course, it takes away the pressure, the credit pressure from governments, but this comes at a cost. And number two, private sector brings in equity. Equity has a return. And so we have to bear in mind that all this is going to be translated into cost for the ultimate consumer. Okay, so some of the examples of programmatic approaches we've applied in renewable energy are in front of you. So for example, we have, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the scaling solar operation. So we have scaling solar, scaling wind, scaling wastewater now, and scaling other things. Scaling, the beautiful thing about this scaling package, it's procurement in a box. We think through everything that our client will need so that they are not at the mercy of private sector prospectors who are coming with them with proposed solutions. Our clients have actually thought through, and we bring in the whole gamut of the World Bank. That's the bank, IFC and MIGA. What do we bring? We bring the advisory at the level of policy, institution, and regulatory, both from IFC and the bank. We bring a risk allocation that's balanced. We bring credit enhancement that drives down costs. We bring, very importantly, standardized and balanced procurement documents, which is critical for our clients, which have well allocated risk. We bring in TA and ad hoc support. You heard, as Bernard said, TA is critical technical assistance. We bring in insurance solutions through MEGA, who are part of the World Bank, and therefore we have a very streamlined tendering process. So just as an example of another, what we like to call programmatic approach is a risk sharing facility. I'm sure many of you have heard this. It's become quite the buzzword, but I think what's important to take from this is the bank intervening in our emerging markets through commercial banks, and we tell commercial banks, provide exposure to local enterprises whose credit risk is not that strong because of prevailing weaknesses in the market, that the bank is also supporting to strengthen through our sectors that work in financial markets. You provide exposure to them through local currency, which is very important because we just talked about the way the challenges of having hard currency exposure is very difficult for many of our emerging markets. Provide that exposure. We will come with you to provide fast loss support, fast loss risk support in the event that because of the inherent credit weaknesses, those clients are not able to pay. So we take the fast risk support. You do that through commercial banks. It's very efficient. It's whole scale. You're able to deploy a lot. And you actually get commercial banks to move their frontiers to lend towards clients who otherwise would not be interesting to them. And many of those clients, of course, we earmark the kind of projects we want. So renewable energy, energy efficiency, and the like. So this has become a very interesting way that we are doing business now. Okay, so now just to go to the crux of it, this is the guarantees. The guarantees do backstop government weaknesses. Very quickly, what have we done to address system-wide barriers for renewable energy transmission lines? We have no IPT. This is independent power transmitters in our pipeline. We do risk allocation, sector reforms. And these are just the benefits of the World Bank guarantees. These slides are very detailed. So when you get them, you can read through them. You can always email me and we can discuss further. Time is a little bit short. I'm sorry, the material is very rich and very dense. Here you also have the criteria for how we look at guarantees. And always remember that every time the bank is considering a guarantee, we're also bringing sector intervention to strengthen the inherent weaknesses in that market that make a guarantee relevant. So there are various types of guarantees. There's the payment guarantee, which comes with a letter of credit, which brings that intermittent liquidity for a project. The structure is well documented. We've got the loan guarantee to help private clients borrow as well. And we have got, for example, the policy-based guarantees to help government borrow to support their budget. And all this drives down costs and brings efficiency and brings private sector. And it comes with the rest of the World Bank gamut. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Apologies for rushing through. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Caroline. I'm sure it's very, very rich information. And again, this session is more just a little bit whet your appetite. We know it's just a short session, just a small presentation. We can't obviously become experts in this little amount of time, but it's more a case to whet your appetite. And then the idea would be in further sessions at another time, we can go into more depth into these topics. So with that, as I mentioned, it's not only about financing, but there are also some other regulatory issues that we need to look at. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Lori.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Lori Bird, I'm with the World Resources Institute. I'm the director of their U.S. Energy program. Before that, I did work for the National Renewable Energy Lab for many years and worked on renewable grid integration issues there. So next slide, I'm going to talk about, oh, sorry. I can do it. I forgot. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what else you need to think about as you're scaling renewables. How do you integrate with them in the grid? How do you make the system work? You're integrating technologies with different operating characteristics than we've had with thermal generation plants in the past, right? And so there are some considerations for how you make other changes to the grid and the operation of the system as you're moving forward and you're scaling renewables. So it's important to think about that wind and solar have daily and seasonal variability. So that's one of the issues. The grids are used to having variability. Loads are variable. People use different amounts of electricity every hour of the day, right? So grid operators are used to that, but we're introducing with renewables more variability on the generation side, which at low levels is almost like just managing more variable load, but as you get higher and higher, it's something that needs to be addressed more and more, and you really need to make the grids more flexible to be able to accommodate that. So, and it can create some new challenges with balancing load and generation, right? Which is done, second by second, minute by minute, and then you think about it hourly and you think about it daily, right? So all those timescales need to be considered as you're integrating more and more renewable generation on the grid. And then I think, other things are grid expansion, that it's really important to consider, right? Because it takes a long time to build transmission. Often it can take a lot less time to build renewables. Those projects can be built in 6 months, a year. It depends on the interconnection queue and things like that, where I think we're finding in the US that now it's becoming longer to build renewables because of backlogs and so forth. But really, transmission is, a 10-year proposition. There's a lot more time. So there's a need to be thinking about the transmission needs. Where are you going to be putting some of these renewables, and making sure you're planning for that. The other thing is, and when you get to very high penetrations of clean energy, making sure that you have a mix of generation sources that provide sufficient variability and operating characteristics to be able to operate the system. So you need some dispatchable resources on the grid, right? So you're not going to be dispatching your solar when the sun goes down, unless you have storage available in the system, right? You can operate it with storage effectively, but then you may need other power plants that can be dispatched on the grid when needed. So, I think Barbara's going to talk more about curtailment of renewables next, but, it's a financial issue for renewables. If you're building them on the system, really, you want to get as much of that clean energy onto the grid as possible, right? How do you avoid that curtailment, not being able to operate those plants when they can be providing electricity? So it's something to plan for and think about. So what are the solutions to some of these challenges as you're going forward? I put them into two buckets here: technology and infrastructure solutions. What can you build to help make the renewables, to scale renewables, make sure they operate well on the grid? This is new transmission or grid upgrades. It's new dispatchable generators that could be complementary to wind and solar. So it could be just geothermal. It could be thermal plants with carbon capture and storage. People talk about using hydrogen, clean hydrogen in plants as well. It's potentially storage investments and that includes both hourly storage. So we see a lot of lithium batteries being used today, but they really deal with like the daily variability, providing 4-hour storage typically for renewables. But as you get a lot of renewables on the system, thinking about, well, what if, you have in the wintertime, if you're generating a lot less solar in those periods, right? The sunlight is reduced, right? What are you using to fill in there? If you have prolonged outages, storms that exceed 3 days, a week, right? What are you using to fill in? And that becomes important as you get to higher and higher penetrations, not so much of an issue with low penetrations of renewables. So, and then the other thing is demand side flexibility. So, you have all these customers using electricity on the grid, and there's a lot of flexibility there that is unmined, right? But with new technologies that have emerged, there's a lot more potential to be mining that flexibility in the system. So making those early investments, smart grids, smart meters, and enabling customers and corporates to be using their demand side flexibility. Electric vehicles, right? We want to be using the electricity to charge those at the times of day where we want to use the electricity, right? It can be paired very well with wind energy. If you're generating a lot of wind at night, right, you want to be charging your electric vehicles then. Or if you have excess solar in the middle of the day, you do workplace charging, right? And you get people to use that solar generation in the middle of the day. So that kind of thing, making sure we're managing the demand side takes time to roll out those programs, and early investments can be helpful in helping to aid clean energy generation scale up. So, and then there are a lot of things that can be done that are more on the operational side of things, and the how do you design and implement power systems and power markets to help aid in this flexibility that's needed in the power system. So there's some couple of sort of basic things like making sure making larger and larger balancing areas. This has been a problem in the US. In some areas of the country, we have very large balancing areas, which is excellent. It's very easy to manage the renewables because you have access to a lot of generators within that larger area. You also have, you're managing load across a larger area. If you have a very small balancing area and you start to get more and more renewables on it, it's not very flexible. And you find quickly that it's much easier if you can be operating in the larger area. So this is something that's, fairly, well, I don't know if it's so completely easy to address, but it's a clear pathway to integrating flexibility into markets. Very fast dispatch is also helpful. You're constantly dispatching, sending dispatch signals to your power generators on a 5-minute basis. So you're getting the full flexibility in the system. Not all systems operate like that. Many are much slower, hourly or something like that. There's a lot less flexibility if you're dispatching your plants much less frequently. We've seen many power markets in the US introducing new kinds of products to increase the flexibility, providing incentives to generators that can ramp up and down quickly, and utilizing that. If you have a lot of wind generation on your system, that can be helpful to fill in gaps with the wind generation. And then there's increasing questions, I think, about resource adequacy, which is making sure you have enough generating capacity to meet your future loads, in the next in coming years and so forth, and making sure that you have the right mix of operational characteristics of the generators to be able to meet all the demand, at every time scale of the day. So now I'm going to talk about a few policies that we've seen adopted in different jurisdictions to try to address some of these things. So these are, you're trying to build renewables. There's some things that are complementary to that it's good to think about early, particularly if you're really trying to scale the renewables. So the first one is really just policy stability. We have seen more than 15 states have what we call 100% clean electricity standards, and about 30 states in the US have renewable electricity standards. So they started out and said, okay, a certain amount of generation needs to come from renewable energy sources by 2030, right? Or something like that, whatever the dates were. And many states have been increasing those numbers, over time to 50%. Now many states are moving to 100% clean electricity, and those policies are broader than just renewables, but include any kind of carbon-free electricity source that can meet those standards. So what happens? I think the importance of something like that kind of framework is that it provides policy stability. It provides a timeline of, you're going to make this change over the course of a certain period. By 2040, you're going to achieve 100% clean electricity. This is the pathway. This, the amount of clean generation that you're going to introduce over time, right? So it sets up a framework for that pathway, the timeline of that pathway, and to be able to think about what are the other changes that you need to make along that pathway. So it's certainly like the gold standard of providing certainty and making sure that you can do all of the other things that you need to do along that path. Incentives for storage. Storage can be pretty cost effective in many jurisdictions as well, and the cost of batteries in particular have come down substantially over time. Long duration storage is still more expensive. Those technologies are emerging, and the value proposition is a little bit more challenging. We do have a lot of pumped hydro storage installed in many countries already, but there's other types of new long duration storage technologies that can fill in those for the seasonality issues, or if you have extended weather related events. But making those investments early, thinking through what kinds of long duration storage might be needed and when is important. I'm going to focus on, and I already talked about the need for demand response and how that can be, there's a variety of ways of supporting demand response, utility rate designs, or, utility programs, encouraging those kinds of things is really important, and regulators can play a key role there to make sure that customer demand, that the utilities utilize the customer demand in responsive ways, and do that to complement the clean energy transition. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus a little bit more on expanding transmission capacity. And I'm going to focus on one solution of deploying transmission for renewable energy zones. And this has been done. Sorry, I'm going to go to this slide here. So renewable energy zone transmission and renewable energy zones is a concept that's been done for many years, and we're starting to see uptake in different regions. So this was done in Texas many years ago, where there was an area of West Texas with a lot of wind potential. They're they've built a lot of wind plants there. They're very cost effective, very steady winds. And it was known that area was very ripe for renewables development. So what happened was the commission and the state made plans to build transmission to that area even before those plants were all operational. So they said, this is where we know we're going to be building wind in here in the future. We're going to build those lines. It takes 10 years to build the transmission. It's much quicker to build the plants. We're going to get a head start and plan that transmission for these areas that we know that we're going to try to utilize for the renewables. So, and this has been done.
The slide is on Australia, not Texas, by the way.
That's true, I know, but I was teeing it up that this was done a long time ago in Texas, but it's been utilized in other areas too. And so Australia has been doing this as well, and planning, identifying zones for their own renewables deployment, and developing scenarios, studying that, figuring out how many lines they're going to build. There's some already in process, some they need to start very soon, and then identifying some of the potential long-term projects. Yeah, and Barbara, if you want to say anything else later about any of this, you maybe have some slides on it too. Okay. So let me jump to some of the markets and operational solutions. This gets a little bit more complex in terms of how this can be done, but there are many solutions that are lower cost and just operational that can be also implemented instead of just building more transmission or making other kinds of grid investments or building new generation. Sometimes it's just making sure you can access the generation when you need it. You're operating it more efficiently. So I'm not going to get into all of these things, but I've mentioned some of them already. This is the list. So these kinds of solutions are really important to consider along the pathway as you're increasing the share of renewables, to make sure that the system, you're changing the operating characteristics of the generation sources. You need to think about, well, what does this mean for the system, and how do we continue to efficiently operate it? So there's a lot of different ways to do that in terms of balancing the system and the approaches that takes, and how you're compensating generators for different kinds of services that they're providing to the grid. So new products are being developed to make sure that we're getting those characteristics, things that thermal plants may have been providing in the past. So let me wrap up with this slide in terms of what should governments do, regulators, policymakers, what kinds of actions really are important to think about and to implement. So really, number one is planning for grid change, right? So thinking through this, government and policymakers and so forth play a key role in planning and analysis and determining deployment pathways, kind of figuring out what are the pain points that are going to emerge. How much renewables do we have? When are we going to have it? What other generation sources are there? What grid constraints do we really have? What's this going to look like in the next 10 years? So really understanding that, doing the planning and the analysis and making sure that that is done. Also bringing together stakeholders, doing that coordination, education of key stakeholders to understand, there's an energy transition that's occurring here. We need to understand it all. We need to make proactive changes to be able to make this work well going forward, and getting people on board and getting them the information they need to take action. driving policies for increased grid flexibility. I've talked about some of what those are already. But really what we want to do, you want to be able to make sure that the whole system is working well together. You're introducing flexibility on the generation side and making sure that grid can handle that flexibility in different ways. And demand response, is a key part of that. Flexible generators, new products, all that kind of stuff. So identifying what those policies are that work for your jurisdiction, what is feasible to implement, what is politically appealing, and so forth. But having those policies, and I think we've heard before that just policy stability is incredibly helpful in moving markets more quickly. So that's why I've talked about the issue of clean electricity standards and the certainty that they can provide, and the ability to plan and implement with those. And then I think, some of the other roles are, in addition to coordination and facilitation, education and capacity building to gain consensus. And that's not only key stakeholders, but really also communicating to the public of some of this need. So, and finally, supporting financing of new technologies. We've heard about financing options from earlier speakers. So I'm gonna wrap it up there, but those are, I think, some of the key roles types of actions that are really needed, along with, just bringing the projects online.
Thank you very much, Lori. So effectively, there's a lot of reducing the uncertainty of knowing what the policy will be, what the government intends to do, and reducing that uncertainty is what helps, I guess, to get more private sector involved. That's my
yes, definitely.
Very good. With that, let's move to Barbara, who'll be joining us virtually. Unfortunately, she was unable to be here in person. And let's get into an example of the nitty-gritty of things, of what happens now that you have renewable energy deployed and some of the issues to be able to sustain it. So Barbara, over to you, and just advise when we need to change slides to have a clicker.
Thank you, Jimmy. So yes, I do apologize. I was supposed to fly out on Wednesday and I caught some sickness. So I also apologize in advance if I need to go off camera and have some coughs, right? I have my tea going, but yeah, I should have been there. And I hope you have had a great experience here yesterday with the SIF meetings. They look very interesting. Next slide. So I'm backing up a little bit too to set the stage, and these slides will also be a nice leave behind for reference. But when I try to explain to mostly investors, because we deal with a lot of funders who are looking for the latest and greatest sort of buzzword or technology to push. And I always want to back up and go, well, let's just look at utility scale renewables. Now, here's just an overview that I found from a Google search, but it's so fun to look at how many countries have these targets. A lot of them go to net zero carbon at 2050. So that is a chunk of work that we need to do. And it's also nice to see the countries in this depiction that are out in front and trying to get to net zero at an earlier date. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory are these studies to help jurisdictions understand how they can get to net zero. So this is not just the power sector. This is when we're looking for 100% carbon neutral or 100% renewable. I mean, there's different ways to define it, of course, but we did a study for the city of Los Angeles and looked at the different sectors. So not just power again, but also the transport sector, industrial sector, really across the board. What are the pathways and how much will it cost you, and relative to each other with respect to various scenarios and policies, and then what happens to the people, what happens to the health benefits, the environmental emissions, to the economy. And we've since started down the path of that 100% study in Puerto Rico, and we're starting it now with the country of Lithuania. And we're talking to a number of other jurisdictions that are smaller, states or municipalities, lots of clean cities. Next slide, please. And so one of the things you do when you look at the power side is, okay, what will happen under various scenarios to the mix of the generation assets? And for the LA 100 side, we looked at sort of a business as usual case that you see getting to 88% under their existing laws. And then some other scenarios that we looked at, like easy transmission build out, more of a distributed generation play, sorts of things. But my point is that if you look at the current, the 2020 sort of baseline on the left, and then look at the 4 different bars, what grows is this turquoise color, right? Well, that represents utility scale wind. And what grows is that sort of between yellow and orange color, that's the utility PV. And what grows is, you know, add batteries, make it a hybrid project, and that's growing. There's other technologies that come in, especially when you need to get all the way to 100%. That's when you start looking at hydrogen fuels. That's when you start looking at fuel cells and technologies that are further out with respect to the readiness level. But the reason why utility scale wind and solar grows is because it's really economic and it's really available. But what happens is it cannibalizes itself a bit, right? It goes so big that in the end we have, you know, potentially going to negative load curve. Next slide, please. So this is the duck curve. I'm sure you all have seen this curve. This is from California, but of course it's happening in other jurisdictions. And it's where California has been out in front, very progressive with respect to building renewables, in particular solar. And that was because of the beneficial sort of tariffs that it was offering for the build out, right? So you can see each year more and more solar was getting deployed until we get to a point where during the day, it's going below the load. And so this is sort of basic, but it presents 2 problems. I'm just trying to frame it so we make sure we're all on the same page. One is that we've got, you know, the demand curve is completely changed from historic utility demand. I was working with Xcel Energy, an investor-owned utility here back in the early 2000s. And I mean, it was so very different how you would look at your daily load curve and your base load, and then your intermediate and your peaking units. The world is changing, especially with respect to solar, because it's so cheap and it's so easily deployable. So you got negative load, basically curtailment in the middle of the day. And then B, you have a ramp when the sun sets at the end of the day, a ramp that you need to meet. Next slide, please. So what happens then? And this is for some of these countries that are further, they're further out with respect to hitting this point that California is hitting. But what you're going to need to do is really change your thinking and figure out 2 things. One is what to do with excess renewable energy, how to say, you know, charge a battery or use the pump storage, pumping power to get the water up the hill, or to make hydrogen, this kind of thing. Or you move your load to where the renewables are, which is what Lori was talking about. And by the way, hi, Lori, it's so good to see you. Lori was a mentor to me. I've been at NREL for 10 years, and she was just so brilliant when I came into that organization. And I'm so happy she's being successful at the WRI organization. So, you know, there's two pieces to the equation. There's supply and there's demand. So you either move your supply or you move your demand. And this is sort of basic, but I think there's, you know, people sort of jump to solutions that don't consider all the levers you have to make your system work with the clean resources that you have. Next slide, please. So curtailment happens, and it happens when the belly of the duck goes negative, and it also happens with respect to transmission congestion, where, you know, the highest resources, say very windy areas, are not typically at the same place where your load center is. People aren't moving to these super high windy areas, right? So urban centers, not so windy, farther away, windy. Congestion happens, and power gets curtailed. And in even the most progressive, modern, independent system operator jurisdictions, curtailment happens. In fact, you know, there's been many studies that have done, like, is there an optimal curtailment? And, you can get at least 10, and really some studies show up to 20% even of curtailment of wind or solar that still create an economic benefit. So you can build that much wind and solar, curtail 10 to 20% of that power, and still be ahead of the game with respect to your opportunity cost for burning fossil fuel or some other capital investment for a resource. So there's different reasons for the curtailment, and it's very complex in terms of how they are categorized and defined with respect to, was it congestion? Was it just purely economics? Was it an emergency, or was it something that could have been foreseen? And how the compensation or not happens for the seller of the power varies by contract and by jurisdiction. But you can see here in Ireland and in Texas, the ERCOT institution, that we're looking at a projection. In Texas, there's been a study that is pretty considerable. I mean, you're looking at, 20% wind plus another 12, 13% solar. It still is going to make sense with respect to that diversification to clean resources into the next decades in order to meet these targets. Next slide, please. So the compensation piece is very important. So before I worked for NREL, I worked for EDF, Renewable Energy, which is a big IPP, a big utility scale renewable developer. And with that, I was, certainly very worried about how to, what we call, make our economic pro forma work out. So if you have a potential buyer who is saying, okay, you have to pay yourself for the curtailment, you have to take that risk, then it means that as a developer, what I have to do is forecast how often that's going to happen. And then I have to build in the buffer for that renewable energy that I'm producing that's not going to get compensated. It's going to go into the ground. It's grounded power, it's curtailed. I need to build in a buffer in order to make my economics work out to obtain commercial project finance. So when I do that, I'm going to really have to know the regime well. And there's so much uncertainty because I don't know how many other projects are in the queue around me that will contribute to the curtailment happening more. And so again, I'm going to be really conservative. I'm going to build in a bigger buffer. If I'm taking that curtailment risk, my price will reflect that. And there's, like I said, different ways to sort of categorize and different ways to build it into a contractual purchase power agreement. So you can have a contract that says, okay, the seller will take a maximum of compensated curtailment, and then the rest is on their risk. Or you can have the reverse, where the maximum curtailment is at risk, and then beyond that, it's compensated, right? So that's an easier equation to make with respect to an economic pro forma. But invariably, the buyer of the power doesn't want to take the risk of a transmission event happening that it could not have foreseen. In other words, an emergency event. And so there has to be a proper categorization of the reason for the curtailment so that the contract can be paid. And again, it gets very complex, and I've seen it done many different ways around the world. There's not one right answer. It's so dependent on the system and on the structure of the ownership of the system, on the, who has the authority with respect to the regulator, the system operator. Maybe there's a distribution company that's a different entity. So it's really case by case. And the other piece of it is that you have to define what would have been produced. Like, you have to make sure that even contractually that is clear, that calculation. It's not something that's just going to fall right out of a meter. You have to say, okay, let's look at the anemometer, the wind vane in the case of wind, and then the pyranometer, if you're looking at a solar plant, and come up with an equation that represents these measurements for what would have been produced were it not curtailed, if you're going to compensate for that. So it can get complex. But this is one deep area of curtailment that I hope we have another session on, and we can go through some deeper global examples of countries that have sort of walked down a path and did so unsuccessfully and need to change their policy. And Brazil is a great example of that. We talked about Brazil in our internal meetings. Brazil went out for solar back in 2013. They started procuring solar, and actually they were a country that was honestly technology neutral. I kudos to Brazil for letting the market decide between wind and solar and other resources, but they ended up building gigawatts of power, and it was very favorable to the seller. So a lot of developers came in and built these plants, and then what happened was the government, through these form contracts where it's guaranteeing to be paying for the power at sort of commercial operation date, what would have been commercial operation date certain. And they couldn't get that transmission infrastructure built fast enough. They ran into delays that were unforeseen, and they had to pay numerous independent power producers for power that was not even being produced at all. It was literally not in operation yet, and they had to start paying these contracts. And that got pushed through to the consumer, to the ratepayer. So it was ultimately an expensive decision. Just back to what Lori said, you know, the plants, the wind and solar plants, 2-3 year timelines, and then transmission lines, right? 5 to 10 year timelines. So they're not lined up, and you don't want to, certainly don't want to guarantee payment until you know that there's a transmission interconnection that can happen. There's other contract risks that I would love to get into. I've done a lot with procurement. When I was at the utility, I was buying from purchase power agreements, and then I went to the developer side and I was selling. Next slide, please. So
We've got about 1 or 2 minutes.
Thanks, Jimmy. So with respect to risks, we need to consider, again, and Carolyn did also mention these things where we have to look at, you know, the credit worthiness of the counterparty. Is there a state guarantee, for example? That currency risk, it's already been discussed today, different ways to slice and dice the currency piece of it. The regulatory risk, and Lori stressed this, where you need to make sure everything is transparent and the rules are announced ahead of time. And even the political risk. The main thing is to have a plan. I think that Joseph touched on this too. You want to have a concrete roadmap and assign roles to the stakeholders. I love that. That's going to really help the environment for investment. Next slide, please. So we're going to just fly through these. Lori touched on a lot of these with respect to, you know, add the variability of supply to the variability of demand, and you have steeper ramps, this kind of thing. Next slide, please. We have frequency issues with respect to synchronous generation and non-synchronous generators, and we can dive deeper into that in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Yep, that's when we add in the smart, there can be smart inverters that can really help with respect to that frequency stability and the voltage stability. Next slide, please. I want to focus on what has been done in jurisdictions. We've got in the square box the instantaneous variable renewable energy levels that have been seen, and in the round circles there, the annual percent of annual generation by wind and solar, okay? Not hydro, not geothermal, not biomass. So this is how high we've gotten in some very big jurisdictions in Ireland, in Texas, continental US, and then in islands in Hawaii. So this can be done, and there are ways to do it technically. Next slide, please. This sort of summarizes some of the things Lori was saying with respect to how to deal with that flexibility need. And this is going to be a great leave behind deck. So I'm happy that these slides are in here, and sorry, I can't go through them. Next slide, please. Just click through the whole thing for me. We have solutions. There's a lot of technical solutions that I would love to talk about. Again, we can do some of these in the Q&A. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to mention the Global Power Sector Transformation Consortium, of which NREL is the secretariat, but we are helping system operators around the world talk to the other system operators who are ahead of the curve and who are making changes to how they operate their system in order to handle high levels of wind and solar. And I can speak to that at length too. Next slide. We do offer specific technical assistance to emerging economy countries, and we do workforce development and gender programs as well. So I will end there. Thank you. We look forward to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And thanks to all the speakers. What we're going to do is we're going to open it up now for questions, both here in person and online. And I'll just, while you're warming up and thinking of the questions, I'll kickstart with a question for Caroline, because I understand you're going to have to leave soon, actually. One thing that, listening to Joseph, that he had mentioned regarding guarantees, and I also read a report by the World Resource Institute, that they're all very complimentary about guarantees and how powerful they are at leveraging financing. And yet they're not used as much in general to finance the private sector. I think it was just like 3% of the financing was using guarantees when it can actually finance more. Why do you think there's so many barriers, or why do you think there's so much hesitation to use guarantees?
No, Jimmy, thanks a lot for that question. I think that is one of the challenges that we're also facing institutionally within the World Bank Group. And funnily enough, if one looks at the agreement establishing the World Bank, interestingly, the founders of the institution, in their wisdom, had considered the guarantee to be the instrument of choice at a particular point in time. Because remember, when the bank was formed, the idea was to reconstruct Western, Europe. So I think one thing that we have to bear in mind is when the bank is considering providing a guarantee, the issue is, and I think it was also mentioned by Barbara, the counterparty, for the private sector, whose risk we are guaranteeing. And let me just take a step back and say that here I'm talking about payment guarantee. So it may be helpful to just think about the various categories of guarantees that we provide. So the bank provides guarantees because you want to drive private sector into markets. So we think about providing guarantees at the level of the country. And here we are thinking about potentially the government wanting to borrow from the international capital markets, either to support a specific project or to support its budget. So that's one level. The second level is a state-owned enterprise, like, for example, a power utility wants to borrow money from the international capital markets as well, whether loans or commercial banks, to sort of ramp up its operations and just, or maybe finance its capital plan, its capital program. At the third level is where you have a private entity that has been contracted or has been given a concession to provide services to government. So the entity that is going to be buying the services from that concession is a public entity. So underlying all these various levels of guarantees, which are in three broad categories, is the fact that payment is going to be impacted by public sector, because either public sector is the borrower or the public sector is the buyer of the service. For the bank to provide the guarantee, I'm speaking about the World Bank Group, we are doing it therefore because the creditworthiness of that counterpart on the public sector is shaky because of various factors. So in order for us to make a case, and this is part of our policy requirements, it's part of our authorizing environment, we must prove that indeed we are also making parallel intervening measures through the sector that you're supporting to strengthen those weaknesses at the level of the sector. That is critical. And therefore, there has to be the appropriate timing between the time at which that guarantee is going to be effective and the time at which we are going to prove that that effectiveness has been met. I think this is one of the big challenges. Many times we are approached by projects where there's private sector coming in because they have got a concession to provide a service. And in order for them to fulfill the needs of that concession, they have to go and borrow from the international capital markets. So they have lenders like Standard Chartered, they have maybe IFC or Propaco France coming in who want the project to be de-risked, but they just want to slap a guarantee on the project because they are saying as long as the World Bank has a guarantee, the private sector enterprise knows that in the event that the state enterprise that is buying the concession service does not deliver, the World Bank is going to pay. So many times they come to us at a point in time when the deal is already done, and they just expect us to process a guarantee and slap it on it. And for us, we cannot do that because we have to work lockstep with our sector counterparts in the bank to ensure that alongside the guarantee's lifetime, which is normally almost similar to the life of the project, we are also going to go in to provide relevant intervening measures to strengthen the sector, to strengthen the utility. So I think there's a little bit of that as well that needs to be addressed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a question here, Penny. And but it's not
here. Thank you. Oh, I don't know where to start, and I've got to curtail myself, right, in terms of what I want to.
with one question.
Want to say one question. Sure, one question. Can I have a question and a comment? So my comment is, overriding these conversations that we're having now is this narrative of de-risking private sector. And I'm really wondering why we don't also include that in that conversation, de-risking the public sector. Because we focus on it, and I think you mentioned, and maybe one or two of the others presenting mentioned this as well. There are risks for the public sector. Yet we have this sort of one-track mind on de-risking private, and I don't think it's acceptable. And I think we need to have a change in this. I'd like to ask, who does the due diligence? You know, it's almost the private sector has this mentality, we want to sell at the factory gate, and quite frankly, we don't care what happens after that. And we have to change that financing and providing at the factory gate mentality, and a broader understanding of all these other risks that NREL and WRI have mentioned, because it's super important. Otherwise, we're not going to get where we want to get. I have been part of, actually, I think it was the first partial risk guarantee in the energy sector way back in 2005-06 with the independent partnership group, Farida and Pankaj and them. And it took almost a year to renegotiate what the World Bank had put together as a one-stop shop procurement process, right? Taking all of the risks back to public sector, very little to private sector. And it definitely wasn't a win-win. One of the reasons we as an institution withdrew from that actually structure was concern that it wasn't feasible in the long term. 20% real US dollar IRR in a developing country is unacceptable. And I think we have to have really deep conversations on what is acceptable, what risks there are, because we're talking in a business unusual environment for a very transformed energy sector going forward. And the conversations we're having seem to be the same ones. We have to have a risk sharing on the new system, on the new energy system. We have to have realistic conversations. One of the things we did not talk about, nobody mentioned here, was cost. And I feel we've been very, very lax in talking about how inexpensive renewables and a new system is. And I'm not pushing back to the fossil, right? I'm just saying, as we've gone down this slope, costs have been increasing over time. They have not been coming down because we've got to look at it as from a system perspective. So I'd love to carry on, but let me stop now. Thank you.
Anyone doesn't take up? We have a question in the back. And then over here. Okay.
Thanks very much, Jimmy, and thanks very much the excellent panel members, Carol, Laurie, and the last presenter, including Mwanda. Is Mwanda still with us? Because my question actually goes to Joseph. Is he still with us?
So,
Yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
there you go.
But anyone else can jump in you talked a lot about deploying innovative risk instruments, and this question relates a bit to what Penny has asked. And when we talk about deploying risk instruments to attract private sector, we know that when you talk of de-risking, then this risk has to lie somewhere. So what's the connection there with this kind of beautiful instruments that we are trying to put out vis-a-vis the challenges that public sector is faced with? That's part one. Part two is in terms of maybe elaborate a little further in terms of these instruments that you're talking about, but also show a bit of the uptake of these instruments within the continent and maybe the reasons why. The last question is about, you talked of the commitments that we have enlisted in the NDCs. And for me, renewable energy actually goes beyond, I think, what is so much touted in terms of solar and wind and so on and so forth. There are countries that have actually enlisted hydropower at the center of renewable energy generation. But when you look at the financing, it's actually the exact opposite. When you look at hydro financing related to hydropower is almost non-existent. Yet most countries have reflected this as part of what they want to advance to achieve their climate goals. So how do we address that contradiction vis-a-vis the climate ambition that we've set in our NDCs? Thank you.
And let's just take a couple more questions and then we'll try and get some answers to go here. And then Pauline, then we have a question online.
Thank you. Thank you for this very illustrative presentation and interesting information. But I think that we are having an enormous gap in this kind of discussion. This is a social topics. The urgent need to increase alternative energy sources is unquestionable. Everyone is aware of this, but only to seek decarbonization, but not to improve the living standard of the world population. However, over time, the implementation of alternative energy projects have overlooked the social analysis of those populations that may be affected, privileging only the focus of the natural element of the environment. For example, in Oaxaca, energy projects have come into conflict with the land ownership of indigenous people. Under this situation, it is necessary to propose a comprehensive analysis to define investment. Of course, it is necessary to review and update and make an adjustment to the legal framework, that is clear. However, it is also necessary to define the basis for a necessary reformulation of the impact assessment procedure currently in use in our countries in order to reduce the gap on social topic in this new system of energy. Likewise, we must ensure that the improvement of relationship and interaction between private sector, the government, society, particularly in projects in social interest, such as energy generation. So I think that, as I said before, in this discussion, in this forum, the social topic, the relation with indigenous people, relation with land tenure, all this is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pauline, then we have a question online, and then we'll see a round of answers.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for these very insightful presentations. Just a quick comment to Laurie about the solutions that you were presenting. And I just wanted to touch upon the fact that I feel as if some of these solutions also have reached a bit their limitations in a certain way. And I'm thinking particularly about the whole argument of the batteries, you know, trying to get bigger batteries, but this comes with bigger hazard, bigger questions of waste management. If you think some of them, depending on the charging cycle, might have 20 years lifetime, the depletion of resources for them, and so on. So I feel as if there's solutions, sure, but we've hit some of the limitations. Same for the electric cars. Even now with the whole V2G, vehicle to grid, has loads of benefits. But one of the problems we're seeing with these is that we don't know now what time, who is connecting to charge when and at what time. And this sometimes can also put pressure on the grid. But this is something that I'm all pro electric vehicle adoption, but I'm just saying that we have also faced some limitations with these solutions. So yeah, if you could just, tell us a bit more about that. And then just quickly on what Penny was saying about the cost, that was actually my second question. That was more for Barbara. When you were talking about this ramp up rate and the fact that, what happens at 8 p.m. when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, and everybody's reconnecting to the grid. And, it's going to be more costly for you for the utility at that time. It's way more costly to be able to provide this energy. And this is inevitably also somehow going to be transmitted to the consumer. Yeah, just wanted to talk about that too. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a little request on my side is to keep the questions a little faster so we can get more questions in. And we'll go for the one online, and then we'll same line presented before. Okay, let's go quickly, Rodrigo, and then we'll go on.
Good afternoon, good day, everybody, colleagues. Yesterday we were presented with the IP from Costa Rica, and it reflected that in some point they have to start looking at the energy sector from the demand side to integrate in that form. And with the we're going to get cities more electrified. We're going to have vehicles electrified, and vehicles that EVs have two very different kinds. The cars that we drive that are not so much the problem, I understand, but the industrial vehicles and the public transportation vehicles and the truck vehicles who need large amount of power and are working normally during the day. So my question and my guess is that we ought to start thinking about energy as a more larger than just producing and distribution, but how the whole concept from the production to the consumption is happening. So my question is, could you maybe go a bit deeper into this? And is there any solutions to trying to produce energy without having to take it into curtailment, for instance?
So one online question, and we'll go for a round of answers. So I'm going to be, if you can please unmute and go ahead with your question.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I wonder if it's just me who raised their hand.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, thanks so much for these presentations. And just a quick question regarding the instruments that have been presented, because I've seen a lot of focus on guarantees, which obviously are important, but I wonder if any of the speakers can dwell on other instruments, particularly to sort of like move away from the conversation around public sector, which is certainly needed, but you still need private sector participation. And, a lot of the presentation has focused on, public sector guarantees, and fixing and addressing problems that take a long time. When I think about the private sector, I'm just thinking about also, really small developers who can't wait all this long until the government or the public sector utilities are fixed. And so I'm just thinking about results-based financing instruments and other that are directly going to developers and shift away the risk to developers. I wonder if any of the speakers can address this question. Obviously, I have an interest in Africa in the sense that that's precisely what I see, that guarantees are less accessible, except for countries as large as South Africa. So, looking forward to some insights from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raul. So let's do it for a round of answers. Do I have any takers? Is there any question? Yeah, go quickly, Caroline.
So thanks a lot. These are very interesting and very relevant questions. Not sure the extent to which we may be able to comprehensively or authoritatively comment on all of them. But let me, first acknowledge, Penny, the comment that you made. Fair enough. And although, I may want to caveat my remarks by saying maybe I wasn't there at that time, and it would be nice to look at the transaction as well. I think the point is well taken, and this is a challenge that we deal with a lot of the times, because in as much as private sector also does have their return incentives, I think we can almost agree that some sort of levels of IRR are just above market, really, and especially given the kind of risk that the developer is taking. So I think the point is well taken, but just to also reflect that something that we bear in mind many times is also, to the extent that risks are transferred to private sector, and I'm saying this with all caveats observed, then that private sector will price for the risk. I think that's just one thing we have to be cognizant of, and further to the mantra that says the party that's best placed to take the risk should be the one to take it. It makes sense. If government can bear risk, it makes sense for government to bear risk. If it does make sense, just to drive the risk down. And in many of the kind of countries we are looking at, we also have, multilateral development banks such as the bank and others, or even bilateral ones who are coming in to support government in doing so. The idea is to drive down the cost of the project, but the point is well taken. Another instrument that also makes sense, and this also ties in with the question that the last speaker raised, sorry, I didn't note your name, is that if projects are properly costed and all the relevant parties bear the risks, in many of our client countries, the affordability question is also very real. And we have to think about viability gap funding, which is more on the public sector side of things. So this also comes in alongside guarantees. And this becomes relevant, especially where we're talking about not just even renewable energy. We're looking at private sector intervention in sectors such as, for example, water, the various subsectors of water, whether it's managing renewable water, providing potable water, solid waste management, and things like that. Viability gap funding becomes even more important. Regarding the last question of what other instruments apart from guarantees can we consider from the private side, especially for a continent like Africa, which I'm familiar with. I mean, in addition to it being my home continent, I've done a lot of work there. There have been many initiatives that have been put in place, not only to finance the private sector investors, through equity. For example, there are many equity funds which are capitalized principally by development institutions, just because their return requirements are going to be lower and because of their intervening power in the market. And therefore, effectively then, the cost that they should be charging to the project should be concomitantly lower. But we also have various blended finance facilities specifically set up by DFIs. And I think here, AFDB is a brilliant resource to look at. You have, for example, I forget the name of the fund, but there's a private debt fund that was set up specifically for off-grid. I think it's OGEF, if I'm not wrong, which is a blended finance facility that also brings in unfunded first and second loss risk facilities from the EU. And then the second layer is fairly affordable debt, local currency debt and that line is mostly provided by AFDB, and I think Propaco and also the German bilateral, not KfW, DEG, I think is also a debt provider. So many of these debt funds and equity funds are set up specifically to finance private sector intervening in these projects. And their costs are cheaper because their funders are asking for lower return. So I think it's something worth looking at as well. Over.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Joseph, let's go to you because you're online in Africa. I've just got a small request that when you answer, if you can speak a little slower for the translation services.
Thank you. Let me try to do it in English. I just want to confirm that through its support, the African Development Bank catalyzed the creation of the Africa Renewable Energy Fund, one of the first Pan-African equity fund. He also created the Facility of Energy Inclusion. So in terms of what I'm bringing here is the perspective of an evaluator, not a perspective or a sectoral expert. Based on what we did found, saying that de-risking mechanisms such as guarantee instrument used by the bank or local government are seen as critical to catalyzing capital flow for renewable deployment. But we found that suboptimal risk sharing can impose long-term financial burden on government, adding to the sovereign debt stress. The case in point is in Kenya, for instance, the president put in place, the last president, to put in place a task force just to review the power purchasing agreement. One, to review the allocation of risk between independent power production and Kenya power utility. So it means that for the government, there is no justice in terms of guarantee sharing. This is why, as an evaluator, we say, can we have other innovative risk instrument a part of a guarantee? Because we know that guarantee is good, but it can also have a negative effect. So we are asking to our specialists of energy to try to get if they can find some other innovative risk guarantee, like we say equity fund, etc., etc. This is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So let me turn to Laurie. Let me turn to you.
Okay, a lot of interesting questions and you know, covering a diverse range of topics. I think it would be interesting to discuss each one of them, probably more than we have time. But I'm going to start with the one about land use issues and indigenous people and social impacts of the clean energy transition. And I think, you know, there are a number of factors related to that. But I'm going to start with the land use portion, and you know, definitely siting of all of these new projects is becoming a big issue in most jurisdictions, right? Like, where are we going to put these new clean energy projects, and you know, what are the land impacts and the impacts to communities associated with those? And it's a very important issue. It's also a pretty local issue that really local jurisdictions, the countries or states or areas need to address it, and typically are controlling the siting and permitting of facilities. So we're starting to see in the US in particular, a lot of siting and permitting reform that's happening. There's discussion at the federal level of like, how do we change some of these permitting processes to expedite them, but still offer protections. And it is very important that we're offering those protections to these you know, disadvantaged communities, indigenous populations, all that need to be part of that conversation, and that this transition of permitting and siting reform. And I think there is interest in trying to consolidate some of those or speed up some of those processes, but still maintain their integrity. And I think all of the jurisdictions are going to have this conversation about how to really effectively do that. We've seen some kind of granting more authority to state level rather than local level, but they are trying to maintain, like we've seen this in California and New York and certain jurisdictions, but they're trying to maintain a local authority and make sure that those communities do benefit and have a voice in the process. And I think that's a key piece, is making sure that the local stakeholders have an adequate voice. It's in the siting and permitting process. And if there's a need for reforms, making sure that that really happens. But I think I just want to say, just in terms of, you know, stepping back and thinking about the social benefits of the clean energy transition, there's also a lot of benefits to think about too, right? In terms of the health benefits, the cleaner air, you know, relying on non-emitting technologies is certainly going to help a lot of the areas that have been impacted by the pollution from power plants and so forth. And there's also, I think at the local level, like if you have households adopting solar generation, we're seeing a lot of interest in trying to deploy those programs really widely, so that you're reducing the energy burden of those populations. They're getting savings from these facilities over, you know, the 20+ year lifetime of them. And so there's a lot of benefits to accrue to many of these populations too. So thinking about the social benefits holistically, I think is really important as well. So I don't know if that fully answered it. It'd be interesting to have a bit of a conversation about it, but I'm going to move on to the comment here about limitations of some of the solutions that we discussed. And clearly all jurisdictions are different in terms of how, like, what is your grid like what are the generation sources that you have, how big is the area, how are you interconnected, like all of these things matter, and it varies, so it's hard to talk about this in an abstract way. But getting more specific to some of the things that were mentioned in terms of batteries, are we kind of at a, have we maximized use of batteries and the vehicle to grid? I think on the battery side, again, it's hard to comment on that. We've installed a lot of batteries in many jurisdictions in the US, and if you look at the planned capacity, there's still a lot more planned, right? But there are limits to the solution of those type of batteries as a grid integration technology, right? They are going to deal with the 4-hour, this daily variability and so forth, but we need other types of storage for different applications or for those longer time periods. So and then we do need to deal with, I think, maybe the life cycle of those technologies as well, which was sort of part of the question, and that's its own thing. There is a lot of work, I think, going on to try to figure out multiple uses of battery technologies, and sometimes they could be utilized in a vehicle and then transferred for stationary power source, or refurbishing those or recycling the material. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in that space, and I fully agree. And there's a lot of people are focused on that. We have, in the Inflation Reduction Act, specific incentives to try to encourage that. So it's an important piece. On the vehicle to grid, I would say that definitely hasn't hit at it's so early stage on a vehicle to grid technology and adoption of it. We've really mostly seen pilot programs. We're actually doing some of this at the World Resources Institute with electric buses, electric school buses. We have a big program, and we're trying to deploy those buses in vehicle to grid environments. And the technology is there. It's more the getting them to operate. How are you going to operate them? Are you going to use them to supply the school as a shelter, or are you going to be trying to provide power back to the grid? And there's different applications, but resiliency or disaster functions that can help in the face of disasters is one solution for vehicle to grid or vehicle to building as well, right? So and I don't think we've really scratched the surface on the potential for those kinds of applications. So I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, but hopefully that starts to get at it. There was a question on cost, and I think, Barbara, I'm hoping you can answer this too, but I would say, I think I was trying to offer sort of a high level picture of a variety of solutions, and they do come at very different costs. And I think in each jurisdiction is really important to do that analysis of, hey, we're making this transition. We expect to be here in 10 years and 20 years, right? And we expect the generation mix to be shifting, or what if it shifts to these different ways, right? What is that doing to the grid? How much more grid upgrades do we need? But how can we also be changing the operations? And I think it's really important that the piece I was trying to emphasize was the operational changes that can be done very low cost, that can result in significant savings. So, instead of building more stuff, can you just change the way you're doing the operations? And that's really important to think about. And we've seen operational improvements in many jurisdictions already that are very low cost. So key point there. I would also say, I think the demand side solutions are also in most of the modeling studies shown to be very low cost compared to adding new generation or new infrastructure. So, but you do have to roll those out and make sure that they're reliable and that they're going to yield the results that you need when you need it. So I think that was part of another demand side question too. Maybe I answered.
No, thank you very much. And so, Barbara, we'll turn to you for any further input. And then, unfortunately, because of the time, this will have to be it. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm so glad that the other speakers touched on answers to some of these questions, because I echo what everyone has said, but a couple that were not touched on. So I just want to say that, yes, hydro is sort of the redheaded stepsister, and we don't talk about hydro that much. I think it goes to what Lori mentioned about Indigenous peoples and land use issues, and effects of the riparian habitat and that sort of thing. It's like the third rail. Everyone's like, oh, new hydro, oh my God, let's step away from that. But it's important, and it's important because you can hybridize hydro with, solar panels, for example, on the reservoir or nearby, and kind of modify the output to create some firmness of the generation. We are having some interest in Nigeria for looking at hydro concession financing and structure, like the design of hydro concessions, as well as how do you best integrate existing hydro, right? How do you have it integrate into the solar and wind that's coming? We even have a project in Ghana that's finished now with Bui Power Authority with respect to hybridizing a solar, existing hydro, adding solar, and looking at integrating that. So there's some work, but yes, it needs to get added into the mix and more verbalized. With respect to the cost question, and it even ties in, honestly, with respect to de-risking the public sector. I actually think that one panacea that I will say for answering all these questions is, let's have prices reflect costs. Let's have tariffs to the consumer reflect costs. Let's have the utility, state-owned or otherwise, those enterprises have their balance sheets truly reflect the cost that they have of doing business. So if we could sort of eliminate subsidies, or at least make subsidies transparent across the board, then it would have impacts on the effectiveness of all of these things. So in other words, time of use rates, as an example, to capture the cost of that ramp. When the sun goes down and we have the ramp, if you move the demand by using a time of use rate, that will help. And then, yes, you add some batteries, oh my gosh, there's so many batteries like projected. What about the supply chain for these critical minerals? What about the recycling and waste issues? I mean, for sure, we shouldn't just go to batteries for all of the solutions, but it could help with respect to that ramp. And let's make sure that the time of use rates are truly reflected, and that they're even high enough, disparate enough, that people's behavior changes. And this is the same for looking at electric vehicles. Like, providing electric vehicles helps the operator, because as people install solar panels, obviously operators getting less revenue. Add vehicles, they get more revenue. Better yet, have them the ability to control, where should those charging stations go, and what time do they need that power, and can they benefit from a vehicle to grid infrastructure with respect to something like frequency regulation. So in the end, it has to be cost and transparency. With respect to de-risking the public sector, it's not just cost, it's also governance, authority. Make that clear, make that transparent, create independence between the administration politically and who's doing the regulatory authorization, and who's running the power grid. Keep them separate, keep it clear, have the documents with that governance and authority public, and that will help in some of these emerging economies as well. I'm going to stop there. I know we're out of time, but looking forward to future discussions, Jimmy. There's so many great questions and so many areas we can dive deeper into.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you, Laurie. Unfortunately, Caroline had to leave early, and thank you, Joseph. I'd like to thank all our guest speakers that came today. Again, this was just to whet your appetite on some of the things. The idea that we have with this learning platform is to maybe do more deep dives, maybe 1 or 2 day events, more tailored to either a type of country, in the sense of like small island states, and be very specific to those needs, or if you're in more like desert type countries, or whatever type of profile, because what the idea is to really tailor things, whether it's specific TA or big events, or like virtual events like today that we did this. So this is just kind of like to whet your appetite. I hope you liked it. We have a survey both online that we're going to have, and also for those here at present, there's a form, I believe, on the way as you go out, or if it hasn't been distributed. If you could please fill it out, it helps us informs us to tailor these sessions to the needs that you have and everything. So I'd like to thank everyone, and have a good rest of the Friday. So thank you very much.